a proud member of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Film Appraisers, the podcast that evaluates your favorite films. Each episode, we discuss a film brought to us by a guest or a listener, and then we appraise it in each of the following categories: narrative, music, technique, uniqueness, and longevity. Each category can get a maximum of $20,000 for a possible $100,000 for the most valuable film. And then we see where it stands next to classics. We see where it stands next to films brought to us by other guests or listeners. I am your host, Josh, and on this episode, we head into territory that we have treaded very little on the Film Appraisers. We're dipping into the classics. This one's from 1962 and directed by John Frankenheimer. Today we discuss The Manchurian Candidate, and that stars Frank Sinatra, Laurence Harvey, Angela Lansbury, and Janet Leigh. This is episode 38, Queen, Solitaire, and Hydrangeas. And joining us on the show, your co-host for the Film Appraisers, the kindest, bravest, warmest, most wonderful human being I've ever known in my life. It's Joe Kane.
Hey, I love Frank Sinatra's music.
Oh gosh, here we go. And that's that, right?
Just a totally random, unattached sentence about nothing at all. Dude can sing.
Oh, goodness. A little bit of a preview here of where we're headed. You know, right now, typically we mention our third co-host, Todd. But if you listeners recall from the last episode, I don't think Todd's ever going to join us again. Well, to be fair, he never really joined us in the first place. So I whatever. It doesn't matter.
He made a little bit of noise once or twice. Totally
right.
Unrelated. Did you ever see the last stand-up special from George Carlin before he died?
No, I haven't.
So I saw it live, actually, while he was working it out at a theater here locally, and then obviously on HBO. And one of the bits he had was how long, which was like he died like 6 months after I saw this, which is prescient because one of the bits he had was, how long do you have to wait after a friend dies before you delete their phone number? And, you know, this is a slightly different situation, but I'm thinking like he kind of landed on, I believe, 6 weeks. So does that mean I only have like a month left before I can get rid of Todd's number?
Okay, the clock is ticking, dude.
It's
the clock
ticking.
is ticking.
And I mean, I never talk to him anyways besides to answer his excuses. So,
but if you delete his number, he's just going to keep bugging you, right?
I mean, he did message me about being on a Barrel House Live, to which I responded, I need reliable guests, not
like we need you to taste the whiskey, not already be drunk when you show up.
Oh, I need you to actually show up, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Wait, maybe there's the connection. Maybe he's just a bad drunk.
Maybe he's just a bad person.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of column A and B there. Well, Todd's not going to join us, but we are very happy that you, the listener, are here to join us. We'd love to have you join us in the after show, the program that immediately follows this show and is provided to you should you become a patron of ours. A lot of perks that come from being a patron. And one of those perks is why we're talking about the Manchurian Candidate today. Should you sign up for our executive producer tier, you actually get to select one of your own films to be appraised on the show, just like Sandi did for today's discussion. Patreon.com/filmappraisers takes you to the place you can sign up should you want to do that. So, Joe, let's talk about this film.
Before that, you also get to hear me if you sign up for Patreon and stick around for the after show. You also get to hear me go completely off the rails and all kinds of things. Bad Southern accents, slip up with my family-friendly persona. All kinds of things happen in the after show. So, I mean, you're missing out.
I'll say it again. Your Forrest Gump impression. And so little known fact, I haven't told the listeners this, but I quote Forrest Gump more than any film alive. It's not even close. There's not even a close second. I quote Forrest Gump quotes more than any film alive.
It's definitely a top five for me, for sure.
It made me very happy to hear your Forrest Gump quote. It really did. I laughed about it quite a bit. Well, we're here to talk about the Manchurian Candidate.
Do we have to?
Dude, I was gonna say, should we get started? Like,
let's get
ready?
Let's get into it. I'm already looking forward to the after show. Let's get rolling.
Okay. Well, let's kick it off with the logline from IMDb. A former prisoner of war is brainwashed as an unwitting assassin for an international communist conspiracy. We talked, Joe, before. So before you started the film, I had actually just finished the film, and I texted you and asked you if you were having trouble watching, because something just told, like when I got done with it, something just told me that might be the case for you. So I'm really interested your total experiencing not your experience watching the film, but your experience trying to start the film. I am really interested in hearing that, because I haven't heard yet how that went.
So before we get into that, I had the film on this third screen over here. And I am about 120 seconds into a scene where they are overlapping two scenes at the same time where you can't really see either one of them. So that happens about 400 times. Anyway, my experience with the film, I had to rent it twice to get through it. And I still spent more money on coffee than I did on renting it. So, and coffee to consume while watching it. Entirely that. In the tortoise and the hare of film worlds, we are definitely dealing with a tortoise on this one.
Man, I don't know what to. Okay, let me stay on target here.
Stay on target.
My experience was a little similar. I had to watch it in pieces, but that was purely just because of schedule. Like I started it and something happened. I had to go take care of something else. And then I watched it. I sat down and watched it. And I think you'll see with some of my valuation, I got towards the middle portions and I fell asleep for a second, like when you kind of nod off for a second. And I thought, I'm going to fall asleep if I do this. So I turned it off and then I finished it in the morning. It's not a bad film. It definitely has things that don't make it super valuable. Is that fair to say? Like overall, does that kind of sum up the film?
Hey, there are some like really, really amazing cars that were made at the turn of the century that you wouldn't drive to the grocery store in now.
Very, very fair. That's a really good analogy. Really good analogy. Yeah, I like that.
I wasn't going for an analogy. I was just spitting some random facts, but apply that as you may.
But do you get like that towards like most classic films? Because this falls into like the classic films or the films from that era. It is a classic, but I don't want to lump it in with a classic when I say this. Films of that era definitely fall into that kind of category where it's tough to follow. Not tough to follow. It's just tough to stay engaged sometimes.
It depends. It is hit or miss for me. Like, this movie is going to come up a couple of times, and I'm using this one specifically as an example here because it is another one of these political satirical thrillers that came out right in this era. Like, I think 2 years later, I never have a problem watching Dr. Strangelove, right?
Oh, no, by far, no.
Just pulls me right through, right?
Yeah.
That came out right after this. There's just it's like, I feel like I'm reaching here. So this is probably all entirely wrong, but if I'm going to pick a thing here, this film and a lot of films of this era sort of feel like maybe like clean, obviously, but clean proto Tarantino movies where there's just a lot of dialogue constantly. But in Tarantino films, that's really fast and it's bang, bang, bang through scenes and the dialogue is fast. You also get sort of the same thing with like some of Aaron Sorkin's TV shows, right? Where it's just fast dialogue the whole time. And I think if you're going to rely on long, lengthy dialogue scenes, that speed helps a lot. This film has a lot of scenes that are just long dialogue scenes, but they're also slow dialogue scenes, which is very of the era. There was not, there's a thing I put here talking about these classic films. It bothers me, and it is the way dialogue is delivered in these older films, a lot of these older films, as if they were still on stage and not on screen. And there's a lot of slow projection. They're talking very loudly, even when they're whispering. And they're talking very slowly, even when there's no need to, so that people in the back can hear, right? And this film feels like that a lot, and that feels bad on screen. It's a product of the era for sure, but
that's a fair point. Laurence Harvey is a theatrical actor too, and I can see where his definitely translates into his performance.
Well, even Sinatra's stuff. I mean, he's primarily a stage performer, right? Although not necessarily a theatrical actor, but he's still a lot of the dialogue out of him is still say it with your chest, right? Like it's still very loud. It's very, like I'm sure you could hear him reading his lines 50 feet away when they were doing this, right? And the volume doesn't necessarily bother me, but when you're talking that loud, it adjusts your pace. You can't, it just does, right? And I think it probably felt really natural on film in 62. It feels wholly wrong in 2021.
But it has the, I wouldn't say shocking violence, but for the film you're watching, you don't expect a couple of the violent scenes to happen, right? You don't expect to see in the dream sequence blood splatter, brain matter and blood to splatter up on the wall. Like you don't see that coming. And so when you have those kinds of sequences every once in a while among longer dialogue, it definitely helps overall with the film, but there's just too much long dialogue scenes. If they could have cut some of those out, it'd been okay. Like I can deal with some of the long one of my favorite parts is where Frank Sinatra and Janet Leigh are on the train and you get both of them together in the same shot and they're talking and you can see both their faces and they play off. It's great dialogue, really good dialogue, great acting. But when you have so many scenes like that, it drags on. Like I know it might be difficult, but this film should be like an hour 20. You know, it may be a little less, and I think it would be better if it was a little short. Actually, let me put this a different way. It's not a bad film. It's a good film. I think it would last longer. I think it would translate better now if it was just a little shorter. This
is like a peak example of what I keep mentioning as we reach a little bit further back, and this is a lot further back than we've gone really, but what general audience expects out of films absolutely affects a film's longevity, its perceived quality to a new audience, I should say, right? And this is so far removed from what people are used to seeing in films. Like who is the new audience for this? Right? Like this, like I can't imagine like my younger cousins or like their kids, even unless they're
watching this.
Yeah, unless they turn into massive film nerds as they get older, this isn't going to happen, right?
Yeah.
You and I are film nerds, and we both struggled a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
Just the pace of, it's not to say that this wasn't standard pace for a film. Actually, I have this in my narrative notes here, so I'm skipping ahead of it.
It's a little longer, I think, than standard.
It's a little longer longer than standard for the era, for sure, lengthwise. But the pacing is considerably, I would actually say, a lot faster and snappier than a lot of the films I have seen in this era. Not all of them, right? Like there's definitely faster and snappier than this, but a lot of the films that I've seen in the, we'll say 50s, early 60s range just feel like they're moving at a glacial pace, right? And this feels faster and snappier than that. It's actually really good for the era, but totally out of what is kind of acceptable now. If a movie came out paced like this, now no one would watch it.
It's called Nomadland.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I actually think Nomadland, while very slow, if you watch these back to back, if you watched this and then Nomadland, you'd probably be like, wow, Nomadland is quick.
You probably would, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Nomadland's even close to as slow as this is. Although it is slow. It's slow.
It's slow. And there's just not much to it. Anyway, side jag. Hey, let's get into the valuation.
Yeah, since I started jumping the line already, let's do it.
It's a line stepper. All right, narrative. You want me to kick us off with narrative? I'll get us rolling here.
Run it.
I've got an overall feeling of this film that, let me start off before we even get to the narrative to say, because I don't want people to get the wrong impression. This isn't a bad film. Like this is a classic
speak
film.
for yourself, bro.
and the reason why this film, the reason why it's a decent film is because it's got some stuff in here you've never seen before. And it's got some, I mean, I can imagine in 1962 seeing some of this stuff, just thinking, wow, this is way ahead of its time. It's not a bad film. And if you watch this film, you will have your eyes open in a handful of scenes thinking, I can't believe I'm seeing this. Just because the way you see it in the presentation, it looks like an old film, but you see some things that you would only see in movies today. So it's not a bad film. I just don't think it's as valuable as a lot of critics want to make it. And we'll get into that more. I'm jumping the gun here, but I just wanted to say that because I feel like we've dogged it from the very beginning, but we're not dogging it. We're pointing out
Josh,
some things.
This is what we do. We dog a film for the first half, and then we rate it higher than people think.
And then we get it. That's true. That's right. Colin pointed that out to us a long time ago, right?
This is how we run it, right? We got to make sure everybody who likes to hear us dog stuff hears us dog stuff, and then we give it the value so the people who want to see high values get their high values.
This is why this team works together well, because I forget those things and you remind me. You're exactly right. 90,000. So
I had 99. Wow. I guess I can come now. We could split the difference. 96, 95.
All right. So narrative, to me, I think that there was a lot here that I liked. There was just not enough for me to be like head over heels about it. And so if you translate that into the valuation from 0 to 100,000, there's a lot I liked, which gets me up to the middle to that 3/4, but not enough for me to push over into that 3/4 era. What am I talking about? Area. So that's where I was like, and I think that translates a lot about the acting of this film as well. The acting's okay. There's some acting that's not that good, right? There's like portions that aren't that good. There's portions that are good. There's portions that are really bad. Frank Sinatra, it's like he's okay in some scenes, but some scenes you're like, ooh, that's rough.
Yeah, there's a couple of spots where he's like, there's a couple of spots where it was bad enough to take me out of the film.
And I saw an interview with Angela Lansbury, and she said Frank was a 1 to 2 take guy. He's not doing any more than that. So he'd get in, he'd get it done, and if you didn't like it, that was that. He's not going to do it anymore.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. And speaking of Angela Lansbury, she's a great actress, but there was some scenes at the beginning of the film that I felt were just way overacted. Like she put far too much in it. In the later scenes, she settles in nicely and she's really good. I think overall she's good in this, but there were some times where she was a little overacted. I mean, we get people like Janet Leigh. I'll admit this. Janet Leigh's like one of my classic film crushes. Like I think anything she's in, it's just like garners my attention. And I think she's a great actress. She does a great job. But then we get things like the guy who plays Corporal Melvin, a guy named James Edwards. He's the guy that wakes up from the dream sequence of the dream where Raymond shoots the young soldier. That guy wakes up from the dream, and his acting is awful. It is absolutely awful. So as far as acting goes, I think we get some that shine, some that don't. I don't know what to say about acting. It's not enough to make me think that this is up there at the top, but it's not enough to put me down at the bottom. What I do like, though, in the narrative, though, is what I do like in the narrative is that some of the lighting makes this film look really gorgeous. But then again, what I said, like part of me sees things that make it really good, and then there's a lot of things that take it down quickly because some of it can be really harsh. And maybe that's intentional, maybe it's not, but it's distracting nonetheless. So I'm kind of on the fence there. There were some things about the story and the plot that I really enjoyed. So you and I were joking about this earlier. The fight scene, the choreography in the fight scene, I really enjoyed it, but I'm not going to evaluate it high because it's not good. It's just entertaining. Like I laughed and had a great time with it.
And it also sounds like someone's whacking a side of beef with a robo
ping pong paddle.
Yeah, just that's not what punches sound like. He's punching a shirt. Why is it wet?
I saw an interview with the screenwriter, with Frankenheimer, and with Frank Sinatra. It was actually in 1988 when they finally released the film. It had been Sinatra kept it back for a long time, but when they re-released the film in '88, they had an interview with those three folks, and Sinatra like held up his pinky finger, and it was just one of those, you know, like when a boxer shows you his nose, and you're like, yeah, that thing's been broken. Sinatra picks up his finger, and you're like, yeah, that thing's been broken before. And he said it was in that scene where he chops the desk, and he goes through the desk,
and it blows a like 3 foot wide part out of the desk.
Well, he said they cut it. He said they cut the desk so that I could go through it. He's like, but yeah, I broke my finger on that one, and you see it. It's nasty looking, but it was fun. I mean, it's not going to get valuation from me because it just wasn't that great, but I had a good time with it. The whole story, though, I'm kind of getting off topic, right? The sidejack for the whole episode here. I feel like what we're going to do. I like how the story's put together. It's fun. It's really interesting. And considering the time when it was released, I think that adds some value to this category. But good grief, the runtime's just so long. There are scenes that drag. And can't believe I'm saying this, but I think you could probably cut out the whole Janet Leigh parts and you would be fine. And so because of that, I cannot get over the 15,000 mark. Like, I can't get higher than 15,000. In fact, I'm at 14,500.
So I'm right with you on all of that. But what I gave him a little bit higher. I came at 15, so right above you.
Yeah, right there.
And what I gave it a little more on was how much it trusted the audience to follow the film. We don't see that a lot now. We see a lot of films just explaining every single beat. And this film really just kind of lays out what's going on and expects you to keep up with it. And I appreciate that because you've said it before too. I think the general audience is a little bit smarter than films tend to treat them.
Than the studio thinks they are.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, there is definitely a fair number of people who spend 3/4 of a movie looking at Instagram. And those people probably would not follow this film very well. And even me watching the film carefully, it did lose my interest a couple of times to the point where I was like nodding off. And that wasn't great for being trusted deeply. But I think when this film was a contemporary film, that probably was a different story because people, we're not used to the ferocious pace we are now of everything. But I did really appreciate the filmmaker trusting the audience to keep up with what's going on in the film. I also gave some bonus points for really solid drunk acting. I don't know, they could have actually been drunk. This is a different era. And the pacing, like I said, the pacing was remarkably good for the era, although still very slow, very, very slow. Super, super slow. And then grading on a curve, stylistically, I know we look back really fondly with the rose-tinted glasses at acting of this era, but if you put like most of the acting of this era against most of the acting, say post let me rephrase that. If you put most of the like top tier acting of this era against most of the like top tier acting of say like the past 25 years, the acting of this era is very much so still kind of stage acting, and it does not play as well on screen, but they were still figuring that out at this time. Right. So like, I can't fault them too hard for that, but I would never I have to grade the acting on a curve for that a little bit. Right. Because it's just where they were in filmmaking period. I mean, if you put the best actor in this against the best actor, I haven't seen it, but I'll bet you there's some acting that comes across less stagey and maybe a little better on screen in the remake than this. I never saw the remake, to be honest with you, but even if it's a mediocre movie, like just some of that stage acting trappings just feels silly on screen.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the way they project their voice. It's some of like the really aggressive over emoting. Do you know what I mean? With like,
yeah,
where they're being very grand so that you can see what they're feeling if you're 40 seats back, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't need to do that on screen because the camera's 6 feet away.
Yeah.
But we haven't got there yet, right? We're not quite there yet in film. So I graded the acting on a curve because all things considered, most of it is pretty good. Although there is definitely some spots where you're like, oh boy, yeah.
I think that's fair to grade it on a curve, because when we finally do come across films, like I'm looking at our definitive list, and one of the earlier films on the list in the top 15 or so is Vertigo, and I'm thinking, hey, the acting in Vertigo is really good. Like it never comes across as cheesy or acting like you would expect from this era, like what you're talking about, that's theatrical in nature. It's really good acting, and so we reward when we see that. And likewise, we should not knock it completely down because there is some of that era. But yeah, I think grading on a curve for the acting is totally fair for a film of that age.
Yeah, I think you have to. I think with even when you go back to like, I'm going to say the modern era of films probably starts in the 80s when you take the big stylistic shift and how that stuff goes. Mm-hmm. Even in the 70s, there's a lot of films that feel really old, but that's just because that was what films were then. The 80s, there are a lot of 80s movies that feel pretty contemporary still.
The 70s, it was like half and half. 70s, we were coming off of, we were halfway in between getting rid of the old studio style and new Hollywood, where we got people like Scorsese and Spielberg and all those folks that changed the way we saw film. So yeah, it's probably like half and half.
And that shift is kind of when we started to see screen acting and not stage acting, right? And so you kind of have to grade a lot of that on a curve because it's just not what was done then, right? It's not like this just has bad acting or just use stage actors and everybody else is using screen actors. It's just not that's just what this is what it was. This is what there was. So yeah, I came in at 15, a hair higher than you. I guess it wasn't that strong of a curve.
Well, it's a lot of categories in narrative. I mean, I get in the acting portion. That's fair. All right, so what? 14,750.
Yeah, let's do it.
Should work. What did you think about the music in this film?
I used my favorite word. It's fine. It's very of the era, right? A lot of these films had that. Mm-hmm. A lot of these films just had that kind of like light orchestral thing kind of just going nonstop in the background. Yep. There's a couple of scenes without it. That was appreciated because a break was always nice. There was nothing exceptional. There was nothing that took me out of the film other than like a couple of times. And I was like, man, could we just get a different thing right now?
Yeah.
It's just a lot of this, and this is getting old. I don't really have a lot to say. To be honest with you, I don't have a lot to say about it. It wasn't additive. It didn't really detract from the film. It was just kind of there and very typical. So I shot right down the center at 10,000.
So you and I are on the same page here. I put the first line of my notes says the score has a very 60s sound to it. I can't describe it, but when you hear it, you know it. You know it does. It just has that sound from that style.
You could play 30 seconds of anything in this film and be like, oh, that came out in the 60s.
Right. It's like a lot of oboes and strings, and then when a big moment happens, it's this big orchestral sound that happens to like emphasize what it was. But what I noticed was like it doesn't differentiate itself from TV in the 60s. Like it's the same sound that you heard on television productions that you would hear in this film or
I'll bet
other
you
films.
It's pretty similar to what you would hear as music at a theatrical performance as well.
Probably so. Yeah, absolutely. It's substandard for film, and it just does. It's like the Joker said in The Dark Knight, right? It just does things. It has nothing more. There was some original music in the film, right? But it's very little. You know, things like the swing music and the Korean brothel and the big band playing when Raymond arrives, but not enough here to actually to do anything. I wanted to be at 10 throughout this film. But I did notice that same, and you mentioned the same thing, the sound that we get throughout, it happens, but they like took it out some. Like I would expect it to have more of this sound throughout the film, but I feel like they pulled some of it out. And so I was really appreciative of having less of this sound. So I gave it more. I gave it 11,000 because they gave us less of that standard sound.
Yeah, but they still gave you so much of it, you were begging for less.
I was begging for less.
They gave you so much of it, you were begging for less.
All right, so 10,500 for music. Why don't you talk to us about technique?
All right, I'm just going to blow through a couple of these quick and then let you do your technique
thing.
Your technique thing. I didn't ding it too hard for this, but the sound design in this film is terrible. It's so bad. Everything sounds wrong. The guns sound wrong. The silenced gun sounds wrong. The fighting sounds terrible. There is it's of the era, whatever. I had to see my piece because there were so many times that things made sounds that you're like, that is not what that thing sounds like at all.
Yeah.
But outside of some of the technical limitations of the time, it feels pretty modern in a lot of spots. They make some relatively contemporary choices, I guess is the way I want to phrase it, with camera angles and movements that I feel like are a little bit ahead of its time. Mm-hmm. There are some nice effects some nice camera effects in the dream sequence and a couple other spots in the film where they do some nice tricks with like panning from one scene to another seamlessly, stuff like that look really, really good. There are some good uses. There's some good use of like close-ups on intense or important line deliveries. So you were like, hey, we're close right now. Pay attention to this line because we've had 400 lines of dialogue since the last important line, and you really got to grab this one. There's a few pretty well framed shots outside of that I like. So there's a shot, as an example, there's a shot where Raymond is sitting and his mother is leaning over behind him, kind of like perched over him. And it is close up on Raymond, and she's a hair out of focus behind him, but she's telling him what to do. And like, there's a few shots like that really, they're telling a bit of the story as well as what's happening on, like, there's the dialogue and stuff where they use the camera wisely that way. The showing two scenes at once that I alluded to, overlapping that I alluded to earlier, was cool and welcome the first time. But man, oh man, did they go back to that well a lot. So much in this film. It's like they only had effects budget for one style or something. It's crazy. It got a little old, but it was still welcome the first time or two. And they do some things like Dutch angles as things get wonky, and I appreciated a fair amount of what they did. There was a few things that were overdone and a few things that were rough, but I came in at 15. There was nothing here that really pushed me over that 3/4.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm at 16, all for various reasons, and some that you have mentioned. You mentioned the Dutch angle. They do that. They set the tone really early for Raymond when they do some of those Dutch angles right at the beginning of the movie. There's some cool little things they do, some various types of shots that are neat. In the car, when Raymond arrives from Korea, he's with his mom and his stepdad and his mom, and they give you a shot that makes you feel claustrophobic. You know, Raymond feeling like he can't escape. And you know that's how Raymond feels because he puts his arms over his head to try to block out his parents. One of my favorite shots in this film, I thought was really clever the way they staged it and filmed it. And it's the scene where the Secretary of Defense is giving his report, and the senator barges in and declares he's got a list of 200 known communists. But they've got these television monitors in front. In the foreground, they've got television monitors. And the camera kind of, let's say, really dollies. It more like just kind of moves side to side somewhat to show the senator on the left making these accusations, the Secretary of Defense on the right surprised at all these brand new accusations he'd never heard of. But Angela Lansbury's character is in the foreground, and then there's televisions in the foreground. And so you're not paying attention to what's happening in the background of these two guys bickering at each other, but the television's showing you these two guys go at it. And so the television monitors are kind of showing you the whole theatrical ridiculousness nature of that argument. But Angela Lansbury's sitting right there. So there's some good shots, and she's just sitting there just, knowing it's all part of my plan. It's just really cool how they mixed all that together. I thought it was really interesting, a really smart move to stage the scene and to get all this in one shot. There are some exterior shots that are really well composed. I think it's pretty in a lot of different composition. I mean, the interior shots are clearly studio, but when they get some of these exterior shots, they look really, really good. But honestly, like, if our listeners are listening to this and they know I'm not going to go watch this film, it's just not interesting to them, at least go watch clips of the dream sequence, because it is, to me, a vast majority of all the techniques points that I'm giving, the dollars that I'm giving it for technique, come from the dream sequence. And it's kind of hard to explain, and you really need to go see it. And if you're not going to watch the film, just know that this film is about a platoon of men who get captured by the Koreans and Russians, and they're brainwashed. And the dream sequence from the soldiers after they've returned shows you how they got brainwashed. It's so clever, and it's so interesting and so unique. They started off with like this 360-degree spin on the soldiers, and then it keeps going around the room, and the soldiers think that they're in this ladies' garden club talking about hydrangeas. And then when we spin all the way back to the soldiers, we're actually in Korea or wherever they had this meeting. It's a really wonderfully planned scene, and they start mixing two rooms. You start seeing the ladies from the garden room. Sometimes you'll see them in the brainwash presentation, but sometimes you'll see the brainwash presenter in the ladies' garden club. And then sometimes you see the crowd mix. I mean, like one time we saw a lady in the garden club holding a bayonet. They mix so many things together. It's just very, very cool. Even later when they do a second dream sequence of Corporal Melvin, who's an African-American, he dreams that the ladies in the garden club are also African-American, which are different from the races of those attending the garden club in the original dream sequence. It just, to me, it is, the whole film to me is just on that. That's the part that I'm going to always remember the most about this film. It's just that portion. So that's how I got to 16. And I'm not, I'm not going to be too hurt if we take that down to 15,500.
Yeah, I think that sounds pretty fair.
All right, you're up. Longevity. I know how you feel about longevity of this film.
So we've talked about longevity a lot, right? Every episode, in fact. And there's 2 points of longevity we talk about: how long it stayed relevant and how long it's going to stay relevant going forward, or how long it feels like it's going to stay relevant going forward, or how long how relevant it feels now. I think we've passed or are getting to the end life point for longevity on a lot of the films in this era, in this category, for a number of reasons. Like I mentioned earlier, who's the new audience for this? It's 1% of people, maybe, if that. Mm-hmm. It's definitely not outside the film nerd group. And I bet if you ask 90+% of people out there about this film, the first thing they think of is the remake. And how many of them even know this one exists? I mean, we're going back far enough, right, that they might not even know that the remake was a remake. The Red Scare stuff does not land the way it once did either, right? Like the Red Scare stuff, I mean, sure, there's a lot of like China talk now, but we're not like in a war against communism in the same way we were when they were like naming people on Senate floors and stuff. Like that stuff is long gone, right?
Yeah. This film was released this was out during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
Definitely has a different impact than that it does now.
I think the bulk of the film value here is how long it remained relevant and its influence outside of itself, but primarily, and maybe to an alarming amount, The value here comes from its like conspiracy theory connection to the JFK assassination, and also like which fueled by Sinatra not distributing it for years. But I mean, what does this film's future look like, right? I mean, who is gonna go watch this? Where does it get points going forward from now in longevity? Where does its value longevity wise going forward from now? Is there really, to me, looking at this, the way us two major film nerds both took multiple swings at getting through this.
Yeah.
No one's watching this anymore, right? You have to pay to rent it. You can't even stream the thing, right?
Right.
It's just gone. So I came in at 12,000. It does have some influence. Its influence, although I will say, is like, I don't think we're getting a lot of films influenced by this film. I think we're getting films now influenced by films that were influenced by this, or influenced by films that were then influenced by this. I think we're 3 or 4 levels separated from this film at this point, but it does have some outstanding influence there. And like I said, there's a lot of talk about JFK assassination. When you start Googling this film to research it, it does not take long to find JFK come up. So it's there. There's just a lot of stuff here. I made the comment about the cars earlier, but I honestly think, which was a bit of a joke, but also fit, but I honestly think those cars have more longevity really than this does. And I'll explain that. Like you might not be a car guy or lady, but you see a Model A going down the road, you go, oh, that thing's cool, whatever. You notice it. You're flipping through Netflix and you see the 1962 Manchurian Candidate. Do you even pause if you're a regular person? I think you just scroll right by it like, well, that's not for me, and find something else. I think the audience for this is gone.
Man, you bring up a good point. I even put in my notes something similar about only certain groups of people are going to appreciate this film today, right now, where we're at right now. And I was a little higher on longevity. I was at 14. And I think some of that was skewed because of a lot of the rankings this film gets. It's always in actually it was in the top 100 of AFI in their 1998 list. But when they redid it in 2007, it actually dropped out of the top 100. It was like 67 in the first list, and now it's off the list. It's part of the nominated films. I can see why that probably dropped off out of the top 100.
It's not that it's what I need to say this because I haven't made the disclaimer because I was keeping my performer straight face on. This is a good film, right?
Yeah. Sure.
There's a lot to say in the positive column on this, but when you talk about something this old, there are like a tiny handful of films from this era that really stick longevity wise. There are, it's the same thing with anything from this era though. You go back to, or earlier, you go back to books. I mean, how many, like percent wise, how many novels that came out in the 50s or 60s does anybody talk about anymore? It's just the top 1% or whatever, right? The bulk of it, life changed so much, it's not relatable anymore. It's just how time works.
Where I'm headed with it is I don't think it's fair for I'm feeling we bring this back towards you a little bit. I was at 14, you're at 12. I think 12.5 is probably a little bit more fair because you just can't evaluate this film too high in longevity because it really just falls into a certain group of people. It's a certain generation, sure, who watched it at that time or still has a love of it. But after that, only film nerds and cinephiles or those who study the art of film or film history are going to be interested in this film. And if you're not part of those two groups, you're out. So I think 12.5 is probably more fair if you're willing to come up a bit.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think 12.5, some people might be listening to this and think 12.5 is low, but I think for a film this age, still being at 12.5 is really high. I think if you went back to most of the films that came out in 62, they wouldn't get 5.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. All right. Uniqueness, our final category, uniqueness. I mean, I think it kind of goes without saying that this is pretty different film than what people were watching in 1962. I mean, even watching it today, I didn't expect or remember some of the graphic nature of a handful of scenes. It kind of surprised me a little bit. I thought, wow, that was not what I expected to see. I can imagine being in a theater at the time, and, like seeing the scene in the Ladies' Garden Club where the young soldier gets shot in the head, like I said, and all the brain matter splatters up on the wall. It's a good thing this was in black and white, because if it was in color, it probably would have started a riot. But I gave some of the uniqueness of the dream sequence. I gave a lot of it in technique, but I'm going to give some of it here too, because I think it's just absolutely genius what they did there. But it is based on a screenplay, right? And we're talking about film here. It was based on an actual book. I said it was based on a screenplay. It was based on a book, so it's an adapted screenplay. I'm only at like 13,000. I'm giving it some points for uniqueness, but I'm not going to just reward it for. I'm not going to reward it for just those couple of things. So I'm at 13.
So I landed at 13 too. And honestly, I felt like I was reaching to get it there because I wanted to reward it for what it was at the time. But it's got a couple of scenes that really stood out. And it kicked off this like short run of like dark satirical thrillers. They all came out so fast. I hate to say this, I don't know what the turnaround was from like conception to screen in this era that well, but
I think the book was 58 and the film was 62, because in one of the interviews I saw, somebody said Richard Condon is his name, something like that. The guy who wrote the book, somebody said, I bet he never thought that his novel, which was advanced at the time in 58, would ever get made into a film 4 years later. Yeah,
I saw that. But what I mean is like, so there was, starting in, I think, 64, so it would have been 2 years later, there was like, I'm going to blank on all the names, but Strangelove was one of them. And then there was like 3 or 4 right afterwards.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I don't know how much they could have been impacted in their production by this film with that short of a turnaround, 2 years. Mm-hmm. But it was like the first one. It's also the most grounded. Those films that came subsequently from this one were all way more like grand or absurd. Like Dr. Strangelove is pretty absurd, right? Especially for the era, it's pretty absurd. Right. I love it. And I actually think a little absurdity would have gone a long way for this. It plays it so straight in some spots that I think some of that slowness might have been helped with a little bit more absurdity, but overall I think it's really great. You said the adapted screenplay. Like outside of that, there's not a ton there to really just throw value at it, right? It's a little unique. It's not hugely unique.
Yeah.
I came in at 11 first, and I was like, that feels low. I mean, I was really dinging it because everything I had read, I had not read the novel, and I'm not going to. I'm going to be honest. But I did look up like comparisons. Everything I had read said that the film, outside of a couple fairly small and one sort of significant change, was a really super faithful adaptation of the novel. It was basically the novel on screen. And, we've had films before that were adapted screenplays, but also they were hugely different than the novel. And I don't hold it against them as much then because they did a lot of creativity of their own. With this being sort of a direct port to screen, so to speak, I was a little harder on it, I think. But I did come up to 13. I thought that was a fair number to throw at it. I'll be honest, though. If you had come in at like 11 or at 12, you could have talked me down pretty easy. Like, I came in at 13 like you did, but I could have been talked down for sure.
That's funny. Well, 13 makes the total 66,250. Can you tell us on our guest list, a list of the films that have been brought to us by our guests, including those that staff here at Film Appraisers have selected? We've got 33 total on the guest list? Where does this one fall?
So this comes in actually in a interesting space that I kind of hate. It comes in.
I see it. I know what you're going to say. It's comes very little, though. It's very little.
Yeah, but we got a reconciliation coming up here soon at some point, so we'll adjust that. It comes in at, like you said, 66,250, which is just above Galaxy Quest and just below Willy Wonka at 19.
Yeah, seeing where it fell against Willy Wonka as you were talking, I looked. It's like $2,000 below Willy Wonka. And so, your gut tells you like, that can't be right. But
Willy Wonka feels like it should be considerably higher than this to me.
Well, you just look at the different categories. You've got Manchurian Candidates, almost 15 for narrative. That sounds about right. Willy Wonka's 12.5 for narrative. Okay, that sounds about right. Music's really high on Willy Wonka, like $15,000, and then Manchurian Candidates $10,000. So okay. But you keep doing that across the board with these categories, and they match up. And I keep saying it. It's like sometimes your instincts tell you, well, no. Everybody's told me the Manchurian Candidate's a classic. It should be up there in the top 10.
I think
stuff like that.
So whenever we do this, we start looking at where it falls, and something feels a little off to me, and then I start comparing the categories. Where I think we whiff it the most is, but I'm not saying this is definitely a big whiff. But I would say where we usually fall, when I look back at it afterwards, and this might be a sentiment I have about this one in coming months, years, whatever. When we look back and compare, the category that usually stands out to me is, we were a little bit tough there, is longevity.
Oh, yeah. I was staring at the category waiting for you to say that one.
It's usually longevity
so hard.
because I look at Willy Wonka now, and I definitely have some nitpicks in longevity for Willy Wonka. And some of it is some of the, there's definitely some, we'll say problematic treatment of different people in that film. Right? But I would say referentially, I think that Willy Wonka's impact maybe deserves a little more than 15.5.
Well, right? And that's why we made sure to do a reconciliation episode, because longevity is dynamic.
Yeah, longevity is dynamic.
It does change.
It does shift around a little bit.
It's always going to change.
And I think it is probably the hardest one to accurately hit on right after seeing a film. To me, it's the hardest one to place while we're doing the rankings, and the one I have the most thoughts about typically months later when we go back, when we talk about them later. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why we wait a year. We do our reconciliation episodes a year after, not a year, about half a year after we complete the year. So about mid-year, we'll go back and look at the films we evaluated the previous year. Let some time set, be able to think about it. And I think that's good. I'm glad we added that episode to do that, because you're right, man. Longevity is hard to pin down. It really is hard.
I'm happy we added those episodes because I'd love to argue with you.
I am totally gonna take a hard look at Princess Bride, when you watch. So what you need to watch is not necessarily Princess Bride. Well, you need the swashbuckling films that inspired it, right?
Right. Yeah. It's all those, because you were really hard on a lot of the things that it did that were totally calls to those swashbuckling films.
Yep.
I keep saying that. I am such a broken record.
All right. So on the definitive list, our top 25 films of all time, assembled before we even started this podcast with 25 films from AFI's various lists. And then as guests and listeners have given us movies to evaluate, we've put them on the list if they've made it. So the top 25, I'll tell you now, the top 25 stops at 74,565. So the Manchurian Candidate did not make it into the definitive list. It's number 38 on the definitive list. And I can give you a rundown of 35 through 40. Coming in at 35 is The Third Man. And then we have the usual suspects: Willy Wonka, Manchurian Candidate, Galaxy Quest, and then Willow comes in at number 40. Still does fairly well, but that's the one that I think, we get some film critics to look at this list or even beyond this episode. They're going to question why that happened, but I think we can clearly defend why Manchurian Candidate is where it is.
Looking at the list, I might think, hey, this could be one or two higher, one or two lower for some films. This one I think maybe could come in one or two lower, although I don't know about Willow. I don't know that I'd put it below Willow. That seems harsh. A couple of these categories, I think there's some of this stuff graded on a curve, right? That I don't know, given a couple of months time to think, that we'll have that curve as high as it was. It's tough to say. It's tough to forecast out like that, right? But I think we may look either favorably or negatively on that curve when we look back at it after having some distance on this one. But largely, it's definitely in the right area.
Yeah. All right. So I want to get into the soundbite next, but I think it would be a disservice if I did not update the listeners with a cliffhanger that we left them with last episode. Joe, we need to know the answer. Did your mom know the quote? Did she know why So Serious came from?
So, yes and no.
Oh, I don't believe this at all.
No. All right. So this is, I'll give you the exact discussion, right?
Okay.
She knew the Joker said it. She knew what it was, where it came from, but she did not know which movie it was in.
All right.
So
50-50. We split it.
So
right?
she knew it was a Batman movie. She knew like the why so serious. Like she knew that, but she just didn't know, like she couldn't pull a name to the film.
Okay. All right. Well, there's some value to that. That's cool.
That's a yes and no, right? That's a yes and no.
That is a yes and no. It's a total mom answer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which also, by the way, speaking of, I posted this in the Discord, which is also going to be the Discord, a topic of conversation here. My friend found, I lost an iPod at my friend's house when in circa 2009 or 10 maybe, right? Years and years ago. And it showed up in its sweet worn out leather case. And
sweet case.
I ordered a $3 30-pin iPod connector to charge it because it was clearly very dead. And I plugged it in and turned it on, and there was like 12,000 songs on it in good me fashion, all of which I would still listen to now. But there was one film on it, just one solo lonely film on that thing, and it was The Dark Knight. And I thought that was hilariously coincidental.
That's very cool. It's fate telling you need to get this iPod back.
I'm never going to use it. One, the battery dies in 12 minutes of use. But two, I was never a big fan of the iPod, but I just thought that was a very wonderful coincidence. It made me laugh.
Well, I was cleaning out the garage a few weeks ago, and I found in a bag full of electronic cords and extension cords and coaxial cables and crap like that, a Zune. So there you go. And I'm not going to charge that thing. I had
after the iPod, I bought this Dell. Maybe it was before the iPod. It was before the iPod. I bought this Dell MP3 player that had physical touch buttons and physical buttons in the front instead of the wheel and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And it was still to this day the best MP3 player I've ever used. And when it finally died and I switched to iPod because you couldn't really buy anything else there for a while, I was so displeased with the iTunes experience and how crappy that click wheel felt, and everything about it just felt so cheap and crappy compared to that Dell thing. That Dell thing, I think, if I remember, was expensive, but it was also, I bought that in 2004, I want to think, that Dell one, and it was 120 gigs, which was wild at that time. And it supported lossless audio formats, which the iPods didn't until way later. It was just so cool. It was so cool. I missed that thing.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of how little ability you have with your own music when it comes to iPods. Well, you mentioned Discord. Discord is part of the, I guess, depending on who you ask, may say the reason or the fault. Others may say the savior of why we're doing the next film. Folks, this is why you should join Discord. Hop on Discord, be the squeaky wheel. You might actually affect programming for our show. And
especially if you can get me in your corner, because then I'll just pester Josh endlessly about something.
Speaking of squeaky wheel, all four wheels were squeaking on this cart.
I was going full bore on this one.
Well, let's. Some people are going to recognize it. I think some won't, but I think most will. So go ahead and let's hear what we got.
Let's do it.
Oh, this is a disaster.
Oh, it'll tunic up quite nicely. Give us your dagger, Watts.
That's not a disaster, Roland. I don't know how to dance.
And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and your hands should alight like a birdie on a branch. And 1, 2 and 3 and 4, and what doesn't lead, he follows like a girl. And 1 and 2 and twirly, 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 and 1 and 2, and you're still getting it wrong. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, you can hit me all day 'cause you punch like a what?
A girl.
That's enough of that! Get back from doing this for you! He's got every time!
I'm so excited.
This is the first one. I've never seen it. I know.
I can't believe you railed so hard against it for so long. You've never seen it.
It's perception. It's just pure perception.
It's wonderful. It's so good.
I know 3 things about it. Maybe I'll know 3 things about it. I know there's modern music. I know who the actor is because he was the reason why we got on this kick after The Dark Knight. And I know it's set in a very specific era of time.
Yeah, but do you know that Paul Bettany plays Geoffrey Chaucer?
No, Paul Bettany, man, I have a Star Wars calendar in my kitchen, and his character from Solo came up, and I had forgotten that he had played that character in Solo. It just reminded me how cool of an actor he is.
Also, blanking on his name, but the actor who played Robert Baratheon.
Oh yeah. On Game of Thrones.
Yep, he plays like the big, friendly, lovable doofus part of their little gang. It's fantastic. Oh, it's great. It's just gonna make
me want to go watch Princess Bride.
I'm gonna tell you, my prediction is that it will not score particularly high, but you will love it.
Okay, that's fair.
That's what I'm gonna say.
Okay, I'm cool with that. Well, over at barrelhousepodcast.com, you've got the feed from your last live, and I only know Greg through you. I've never met him in person. He's a really good friend of yours, but I've seen him post things from time to time, and he's
been in the Discord. He's been in and out of the Discord a little bit. Yeah.
All I knew going into that live episode was that he's like not a big drinker of whiskey. Like he's not a big whiskey guy. Man, I had so much fun watching you two guys interact on that episode because there was portions where I could tell Greg he didn't like it. What you gave him, he was not a fan of, and his face didn't hide it. It was just a really good episode.
So I told him before we went down that if I felt like he was giving things an honest chance and really trying, I would keep leading him gently down the path. But the minute I felt like he was being closed-minded and not putting any effort in, I was just going to give him all the hardest stuff I had.
Punish him.
Yeah, and you can guess which way that went. But it did go for like almost 4 hours. It was a long live stream.
It was.
It was really fun though. I had a really great time, and yeah, you can watch that either on YouTube or actually I have all of those episodes now embedded on the brand new website that I put up for Barrel House Podcast, so you can watch them right on the site too, instead of having to go all over. You can choose, do whatever you want. But that stream was really fun. And in the morning, I had a 64-ounce pitcher full of just the whiskey we didn't drink. Of like the disposed of the dump thing was like giant pitcher of dumped whiskey that was like the last quarter ounce of each glass or whatever. It was a lot. It was quite a night. There was definitely pizza to be eaten when we finished.
Well, check that out at barrelhousepodcast.com. Everything's there for you. Similarly, at filmappraisers.com, that's going to get you all the things, like we like to say.
All the things
are there. Instagram, email, invite to Discord, which I highly recommend you pick up and join us on Discord. Of course, merchandise and Patreon are all there for you. please go check it out and continue to listen for the content that we put out.
While you are hitting up filmappraisers.com, getting your Discord invite, which like Josh said, if nothing else, get on the Discord because the interaction there is fantastic and you can actually influence the show there, right? Like we just talked about. So while you're on there getting all that stuff, also please rate, review the show on iTunes because it makes a huge difference to us, to the show, to the algorithm, all that stuff when people are up there interacting with the show on iTunes. So take a few seconds, do that. We appreciate it.
All right, everyone, for our patrons, we're gonna mosey on. I always think about that. Mosey on down to the after show. We're gonna head to the after show. For everybody else, thank you all for listening. Goodbye.
The Film Appraisers was created by Josh McCrae, produced by Joe Kane and Josh McCrae, graphics by Albert Padilla, and voiceover by Morgan Marshall.
The thoughts, expressions, views, opinions, and the like are those of the guests and the host of the Film Appraisers and do not represent the opinions of any entity associated with the creation or distribution of the films discussed herein.